I asked my son for 1 week, just one. After a fall, after years of giving him everything I had, I thought I had earned that much. But instead of concern, I heard something that split my world in two. We're not a charity. In that moment, I realized I was never part of the life I helped build. What I did next didn't come from anger. It came from clarity. And once I saw the truth, there was no going back. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Lawson, though most people who have known me long enough call me Maggie. I am 65 years old, and for more than 3 decades, I worked as a chief accountant in Dallas, Texas. Numbers have always made sense to me. They behave when you pay attention. They reveal patterns when you look closely enough. And most importantly, they do not lie unless someone forces them to. I built my life on that understanding. When my husband passed away 12 years ago, people expected me to fall apart. Instead, I did what I had always done. I organized what was left. I closed accounts, balanced obligations, and made sure every detail was accounted for. Grief, like everything else, became something I learned to carry with structure rather than chaos. My son, Ethan, was the only part of my life that never felt like a calculation. He was my one exception. I raised him with the kind of quiet dedication that does not ask for recognition. I made sure he had opportunities I never did. I paid for his education when he fell short, supported his ambitions when they lacked direction, and believed in him long before there was any proof he would succeed. When Ethan moved to Austin to start his financial technology company, I followed from a distance, not physically, but financially and emotionally. He said he had an idea that could change how small businesses accessed credit. I did not fully understand the technology, but I understood risk, and I understood him. So I helped. At first, it was small amounts, then larger ones. Over time, it added up to nearly $200,000. Some of it was direct investment. Some of it was credit support under my name. There were accounts I opened to help him stabilize early operations, accounts that were supposed to be temporary. I never insisted on formal agreements. I never asked for documentation. He was my son. That was enough for me. I did not see it as money. I saw it as continuity, as an extension of everything I had already given him. When Ethan married Vanessa Cole, I tried to welcome her with the same openness. She was intelligent, polished, and carried herself with a kind of precision I recognized. She was a corporate attorney, the kind who understood systems and how to use them. At first, I thought that would be good for Ethan. And for a while, everything appeared to be working. But over the years, small things began to shift. Not dramatically, not in ways you could easily point to and say something was wrong. It was more like a gradual cooling. Conversations became shorter. Visits felt more structured. The guest space I used when I stayed over was eventually repurposed. Vanessa stopped calling me Mom and began using my name instead. Margaret. It was subtle, but it stayed with me. Ethan did not say much about these changes. He rarely challenged them either. I told myself that life was simply moving forward, that people grew into their own routines, their own boundaries. I adjusted, the way I always had. I made excuses for things that did not quite feel right because it seemed easier than questioning them. I believed that consistency would preserve what mattered. I believed that if I continued to show up with patience and support, everything would remain intact. Looking back, I realized that belief was not based on evidence, it was based on habit. For most of my life, I trusted that family did not require contracts, that love did not need conditions, and that what you gave would eventually find its way back to you in some form. I trusted that completely, until the day I found out what that trust was actually worth. It happened on a quiet morning, the kind that begins without warning and ends with something you cannot undo. I had just stepped out of the shower when my foot slipped against the tile. It was not dramatic. There was no sharp pain, no immediate panic, just a sudden loss of balance, followed by the hard certainty of the floor meeting my side. I stayed there for a moment, not because I could not move, but because I needed to understand what had just happened. My hip ached in a dull, persistent way. When I finally stood, slowly and carefully, I realized something had shifted, not just physically, but in a way that made the apartment feel slightly less steady than it had the day before. The doctor later confirmed what I already suspected. Nothing was broken, but I needed to be careful. He advised that I should not stay alone for a few days, at least until I felt stable again. It was a reasonable suggestion, sensible, the kind of advice I would have given anyone else without hesitation. For myself, it was different. I had lived alone for years without issue. I valued that independence. I did not like the idea of asking for help, especially when I could still manage most things on my own. But as I moved carefully through the apartment that afternoon, I noticed how often I reached for support. The back of a chair, the edge of a counter, small adjustments, but enough to make the doctor's advice difficult to ignore. There was only one person I considered calling. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time before picking up the phone, not because I doubted Ethan would answer, but because I was measuring the request. I did not want to sound needy. I did not want to create inconvenience. I told myself it would only be for a week, just enough time to recover properly. When he answered, his voice was distracted but not unfriendly. I explained the situation simply. I had slipped. The doctor suggested I not stay alone, and I was asking if I could stay with him and Vanessa for a few days. There was a pause. It was not long, but it was noticeable. In that silence, I heard something else. A faint voice in the background. Vanessa. I could not make out the words, but I recognized the tone. Low, controlled, decisive. Then Ethan came back on the line. His voice had changed. Not in volume, but in texture. It had flattened in a way that made what came next feel rehearsed rather than considered. We're not a charity. There's no room here. I did not respond immediately. The words did not land all at once. They settled slowly like dust after something has been disturbed. I stood there in my kitchen, phone still in my hand, looking at nothing in particular. I could have said many things. I could have reminded him of the house, the accounts, the years. I could have asked him to explain what he meant. Instead, I chose the simplest response available to me. I told him I understood. Then I ended the call. The apartment was quiet again. Nothing had changed in the room, but everything felt slightly rearranged. I walked to the window and looked outside. The afternoon light was steady, unchanged by anything that had just happened. I sat down at the table and rested my hands in front of me. They were still. I noticed that before anything else. No shaking, no urgency, just stillness. My mind began to move through fragments of memory, not in order, not with intention, just pieces, tuition payments, bank forms, conversations I had not questioned at the time, moments I had accepted without examining too closely. I did not analyze them yet. I simply let them surface. What surprised me most was not the hurt. It was the clarity that followed it. For years, I had believed that what I gave existed within a shared understanding, that it meant something consistent, that it placed me, without question, inside the structure of his life. Now I saw that I had never actually confirmed that belief. I had assumed it, and in that moment, sitting alone in a quiet apartment, I realized something with a precision that left no room for doubt. I knew exactly where I stood. If you felt that moment hit harder than expected, comment number 2 below and stay with me, because what happens next is where everything begins to shift in chapter 3. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was overwhelmed, but because my mind had already begun organizing what came next. By the time morning arrived, I was not tired. I was focused. There is a difference between reacting and deciding. I had spent most of my life teaching myself to recognize it. What I felt that morning was not anger. It was clarity. I made coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and pulled out the folders I had not opened in months. Bank statements, investment summaries, old correspondence, everything I had ever connected to Ethan's life and business. I laid them out carefully, one stack at a time, until the table was covered. For years, I had never seen a reason to review any of it in detail. I trusted the structure because I trusted him. Now, I needed to understand exactly what that trust had been built on. I started with the simplest question: what had I actually given? Tuition payments came first, small transfers at the time, but consistent. Then the early years after college, when Ethan struggled to stabilize. I remembered the checks, the transfers, the quiet support that never required acknowledgement. After that came the larger commitments, the startup, the accounts, the credit backing. I wrote the numbers down as I went, not because I needed the total, but because I needed the pattern. What I saw was not generosity. It was exposure. The realization did not feel dramatic. It settled into place with the same quiet certainty as everything else that morning. Then I moved to the accounts. There was one in particular that demanded attention, a financial account opened in my name, originally intended as a temporary support structure for Ethan's business during its early phase. I remembered the conversation clearly. It was supposed to last a few months, just until his company secured proper financing. That had been years ago. I pulled the most recent statements and began reading line by line. At first, nothing stood out. Standard transactions, vendor payments, operational expenses. But as I moved further down the pages, the numbers began to shift. The amounts increased, the frequency tightened, and the descriptions grew less specific. I paused and went back to the beginning, this time comparing dates and totals. The pattern became clearer with each pass. These were not routine business expenses. Some of the transactions were too large. Others appeared too close together to reflect normal operations. There was a rhythm to them, but it was not one I recognized from any legitimate financial structure I had worked with. I did not jump to conclusions. That was not how I operated. But I recognized inconsistency when I saw it. And inconsistency in finance always meant something. I leaned back in my chair and let the information settle. The account was in my name. Legally, it was mine. Every transaction that moved through it carried my responsibility, whether I had initiated it or not. That fact alone was enough to shift the situation entirely. For a moment, I considered calling Ethan, asking for an explanation, giving him the opportunity to clarify what I was seeing. But I knew how that conversation would go. It would be quick, reassuring, incomplete. And it would leave me exactly where I had been before, uncertain and dependent on his version of events. I chose something else. I reached for my phone and called my attorney. The conversation was brief, direct, and exactly what I needed. She confirmed what I already suspected. The account belonged to me. I had full authority over it. No one else had legal claim to its operation. When I ended the call, I did not hesitate. I pulled a legal pad toward me and wrote down a single line at the top of the page. First step, regain control. Underneath it, I listed what needed to be done: documents to gather, statements to copy, identification to prepare, and finally, the action itself. Contact the bank. I looked at the words for a moment before setting the pen down. This was not revenge. This was correction. By the time I stood up from the table, everything was in order. The documents were stacked, the plan was clear, and the uncertainty that had existed the day before was gone. What remained was something far more useful: direction. If you're realizing this is no longer just about family but something deeper, comment number 3 below to let me know you're still here. Now let's see how the pressure builds in Chapter 4. The bank was quiet when I walked in, the kind of quiet that comes from routine rather than silence. People moved with purpose, voices stayed low, and everything followed a system that did not depend on emotion. I appreciated that. I brought everything with me: identification, account documents, printed statements, and a folder I had organized the night before. When I sat across from the branch manager, I did not rush. I explained the situation clearly, without unnecessary detail. The account was in my name. I wanted to restrict access and begin the process of closing it. He reviewed the documents carefully, asked a few procedural questions, and confirmed what I already knew. The authority was mine. The decision was mine. The process would take a few days to complete fully, but the restriction could begin immediately. I listened to each step, asked him to clarify the timing of pending transactions, and made sure there would be a record of my request. When everything was confirmed, I signed the necessary forms and closed the folder. There was nothing dramatic about the moment, no sense of finality, just completion. When I stepped outside, the air felt the same as it had when I arrived. The world had not shifted, but I understood that something had been set in motion. I drove home, placed the folder back in my desk, and made myself a cup of tea. The apartment was still, unchanged, but I found myself paying closer attention to small details: the sound of the kettle, the light across the floor, the steady rhythm of something that did not depend on anyone else. For a day, nothing happened. On the second day, the response began. I did not hear it directly at first. There was no immediate phone call, no message. But by the afternoon, I could feel the tension building in the silence. It was the kind of quiet that follows disruption, when something is trying to reestablish itself and cannot. By the next morning, Ethan was at my door. I knew it was him before I opened it. There was a particular way he knocked when he was trying to control his frustration: sharp, deliberate, measured just enough to avoid sounding out of control. When I opened the door, his expression confirmed it. He looked tired, tense, and unprepared for restraint. "You blocked the account," he said. "I restricted access to an account in my name," I answered. The distinction mattered, even if he did not acknowledge it. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, pacing once across the room before turning back toward me. His words came quickly, layered with urgency and accusation. He spoke about failed payments, disrupted operations, commitments he could not meet. He framed it as damage. I let him finish before responding. "That account has been under my responsibility for years," I said. "I carried that without question. I chose to change that." He shook his head, dismissing the explanation before it fully settled. For him, the action existed in isolation, disconnected from everything that had come before. "This is because of the call," he said. I did not answer that. There was nothing I could say that would change how he understood it. He was looking for cause in the wrong place. After a moment, he stopped speaking. The room grew quiet again, but this time it held tension rather than stillness. He looked at me as if waiting for something more, something that would restore the balance he expected. When it did not come, he left. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. That afternoon, Vanessa called. Her first message was composed, almost neutral. She suggested that we should discuss the situation calmly, that misunderstandings could be resolved. I listened to the message once and saved it. The second call came later, and the tone had shifted. The language was still controlled, but the meaning underneath it was sharper. She spoke about consequences, about complications that could arise if the situation continued. It was not a direct threat, but it was close enough. I documented both messages, noting the time, the wording, and the progression. Then I turned back to the statements I had been reviewing earlier. With more time, the pattern became clearer. The transactions I had noticed before were not isolated. They formed a structure, one that suggested the account had been used to stabilize something that was not as strong as it appeared. It was not proof of wrongdoing, but it was not clean. That realization did not alarm me. It confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a system. That evening, I made a decision that had nothing to do with them. I would not respond immediately. Not to Ethan, not to Vanessa, not to anything that came next. For 3 days, I allowed the situation to exist without my participation. I rested, moved carefully through my apartment, and let my thoughts settle into something steady and usable. By the end of that time, the pressure that had been directed at me no longer felt urgent. It felt predictable. And that made all the difference. If you can feel the tension rising and you're wondering how far this will go, comment number 4 below. Because chapter 5 is where everything finally explodes. The invitation came 2 days after the silence had settled into something predictable. It was brief, carefully worded, and framed as an opportunity to talk. There was no mention of the account, no reference to what had already happened, just a suggestion that we should sit down and clear the air. I recognized it immediately. This was not about understanding. It was about control. I took my time getting ready, not because I needed to prepare outwardly, but because I wanted my thoughts to remain steady. By the time I arrived at their house, I was not carrying uncertainty. I was carrying awareness. The house looked exactly as it always had. Clean, structured, carefully arranged. Everything in its place. Nothing out of alignment. I had once found comfort in that order. Now it felt different. Intentional in a way that left no room for anything unplanned. Vanessa greeted me at the door with a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. Ethan was already inside, standing near the kitchen, his posture tight, his attention fixed. For the first few minutes, the conversation remained on the surface. Small observations, neutral topics, the kind of exchange designed to create the illusion of normalcy. Then Vanessa shifted. She placed her hands lightly on the table and began to speak with measured precision. She outlined the situation as if presenting a case: missed payments, strained vendor relationships, a contract that had been renegotiated under pressure. Each detail was delivered calmly, without emotion. It was rehearsed. When she finished, she paused just long enough for the weight of it to settle before continuing. They needed stability, a temporary solution, a new account, possibly, or restored access to the previous one, just for a short period, until things could be reorganized properly. I let her finish. The request sat between us, clear and unmistakable. I did not respond to it. Instead, I turned to Ethan. Is there anything you want to say that is not about the business? The question was simple, but it shifted the room immediately. He looked at me, then away, as if searching for something that was not there. His response came slowly, without direction. He spoke about moving forward, about not wanting things to remain like this. There was no acknowledgement of what had been said on the phone, no recognition of what had changed. That told me everything I needed to know. Vanessa stepped in again, her tone no longer softened by politeness. She spoke about consequences now, about how situations like this could extend beyond immediate inconvenience. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The implication was clear. If the business suffered further, my name could become part of the narrative. I listened without interrupting. In that moment, I understood something with absolute certainty. This was not a reaction. This was design. Vanessa had not been surprised by any of this. She had anticipated it, structured around it, and was now attempting to manage it. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice even. I told them I had documented everything. Every transaction, every communication, every agreement that had never been formalized but still existed in record. I told them I had legal representation and that I was fully aware of my position. I did not threaten them. I stated facts. The change in the room was immediate. Ethan's frustration surfaced again, sharper this time, but without direction. Vanessa, for the first time since I arrived, said nothing. Her expression shifted slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. The conversation ended shortly after that. There was nothing left for them to gain. When I stepped outside, the air felt cooler than it had earlier. I stood there for a moment, aware of the quiet around me. My heart was moving faster than usual, but my hands were steady. Fear was there. I did not ignore it. But underneath it, something stronger had settled into place. Certainty. When I returned home that afternoon, the quiet felt different from before. It was no longer the kind of silence that followed uncertainty. It was structured, almost deliberate, as if everything around me had settled into place while I was gone. I set my keys on the table, removed my coat, and sat down without turning on any lights. The late afternoon sun was enough. I preferred it that way. It made it easier to think. I went over the conversation carefully, not as memory, but as information. Every word, every pause, every shift in tone. I was not trying to relive it. I was trying to understand what it revealed. Ethan had not apologized, not directly, not indirectly, not even in a way that suggested he recognized what had changed. His focus had remained on the business, on the disruption, on what he needed restored. Vanessa had been more precise. She had framed the situation in terms of consequence, control, and positioning. There was no confusion in her approach. She had come prepared, and when the initial strategy did not work, she adjusted without hesitation. That told me something important. This was not a reaction to my decision. It was a response to losing control over something they had assumed would remain available. I leaned back in my chair and allowed that thought to settle. For a long time, I had believed that what I provided existed within a shared understanding, that it was temporary when it needed to be, supportive without being binding. Now I could see that it had been treated differently. Not as support, as structure. I considered my options carefully. I could restore access to the account, reduce the immediate pressure, and return things to a version of stability. That would resolve the conflict quickly. It would also place me back in the same position I had just stepped out of. I could escalate. I could take everything I had discovered, every inconsistency, every irregular pattern, and bring it into the open. That would end the situation decisively. It would also create consequences that could not be contained. Neither option felt correct. There was a third path, one that required more patience but offered something the others did not. Control. I stood up, walked to my desk, and opened the folder I had been building. Inside were statements, printed emails, handwritten notes, and a timeline I had started assembling. I added to it methodically, filling in gaps, organizing events in sequence, making sure nothing relied on memory alone. As I worked, the picture became clearer. The account had not just been used, it had been relied on in ways that extended beyond what had ever been discussed. Some of the transactions suggested more than poor planning. They suggested adjustment, presentation, a version of financial stability that depended on resources not formally acknowledged. I did not need to name it to understand it, and I understood something else as well. Vanessa knew. Her language, her precision, the way she framed risk and consequence. None of it was accidental. She had seen the structure, and she had chosen to operate within it. That realization removed the last uncertainty I had been holding on to. I was not dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with a system that required my continued participation to function as it had. I closed the folder and sat for a moment, letting the weight of that settle into something steady. Then I made my decision. I would not restore access. I would not expose everything without cause. I would hold my position, document everything, and respond only if necessary. No escalation. No retreat. For the first time in a long while, my actions were not shaped by what Ethan needed or expected. They were shaped by what I knew. And that made all the difference. If you're still here and starting to understand the real turning point, comment number 6 below so I know you're following closely. Now let's move into Chapter 7, where the consequences begin. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm I had not expected. There were no calls from Ethan, no sudden appearances at my door, no attempts to reopen the conversation we had left unfinished. The silence between us was no longer uncertain. It was defined. I returned to my routine slowly as my hip improved. Mornings began with coffee and a short walk through my apartment, testing my balance without thinking too much about it. Afternoons were quieter. I read more than I had in years, not out of escape, but because I finally had the space to do it without interruption. For the first time in a long while, my days belonged entirely to me. The first sign that things were shifting on Ethan's side came indirectly. It was not a call, not a message, but a passing remark from someone I had known professionally years ago. We had stayed in occasional contact, the kind that exists without effort. He mentioned Ethan's company without realizing the connection. There had been an issue, he said, a financing request that did not go through as expected. The lender had concerns about liquidity, about the consistency of available capital, nothing dramatic, but enough to delay approval. I listened without reacting, asking only a few neutral questions. The information was limited, but it was enough. Later that evening, I sat at my desk and thought through what it meant. The account I had closed had not just been a support system, it had been part of the structure itself. Without it, the appearance of stability had shifted. What I was seeing now was not collapse, it was adjustment. A few days later, I heard more. A vendor contract had been renegotiated under less favorable terms. Payments had been delayed, small disruptions, but consistent ones. Each piece fit into the same pattern. The system was recalibrating. What surprised me was not the outcome, but how I felt about it. There was no sense of satisfaction, no relief, just recognition. This was what happened when something that had been quietly relied upon was no longer available. Cause and effect, not punishment. During that same period, another detail surfaced. The same acquaintance mentioned that an investor had begun asking questions, not publicly, not in a way that would draw attention, but carefully, through internal channels. That investor was someone I knew. We had worked in overlapping circles years ago, long enough for him to recognize patterns the way I did. If he was asking questions, it meant he had seen something that did not align. That mattered. It meant I was not the only one who understood what was happening. A few days after that, Vanessa called. Her voice was different from before. Still controlled, but thinner, as if something beneath it had been stretched too far. She spoke about the business in general terms, about adjustments, about the need to reorganize certain aspects. She did not ask for anything directly, but the intention was there, beneath the surface. I listened, acknowledged what she said, and did not offer more than that. There was nothing to negotiate. When the call ended, I sat for a moment and considered what had changed, not in their situation, but in me. I could hear difficulty without moving to fix it. I could recognize strain without stepping in to absorb it. That had not always been true. There was one part of it that did not settle as easily: the children. I thought about them more than I expected. Their routines, their sense of stability, the way changes in a household ripple outward in ways adults often underestimate. They were not responsible for any of this. That fact remained clear, but it did not change what needed to happen. By the end of the month, everything had aligned into something I could see without effort. The business had not collapsed. It had adjusted downward, becoming something closer to what it actually was without external reinforcement. And I had done the same. I was no longer part of a system I did not control. I was no longer necessary to something that had never truly included me. What remained was simple. I understood the structure, and I understood my place outside of it. Ethan reached out on a Tuesday afternoon. The timing felt deliberate, as if he had waited until he could control how the conversation would begin. When I answered, his voice was different from the last time I had heard it. There was no urgency, no edge, just a measured restraint that told me more than anything he might have said directly. He spoke about the business first, not in detail, not with the kind of explanation that would invite questions, but enough to acknowledge that things had changed. There were adjustments being made, new arrangements, temporary solutions that were not ideal but necessary. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a brief pause. It was not uncomfortable. It felt like space being offered, not taken. "We need stability right now," he said. It was not a demand. It was not even a request in the way he had made them before. It was a statement of position. I understood it immediately. What had shifted was not the situation itself, but his place within it. "I am not reopening the account," I said, "and I will not create anything new in my name for the business." There was no resistance on the other end of the line. That alone told me how much had changed. "I am also not responsible for anything that happens moving forward," I continued, "financially or otherwise." Again, no argument. Vanessa's voice was faint in the background, not speaking, but present. It felt different from before. Not directing, not correcting, just there. I allowed a moment to pass before continuing. "There is one thing I do expect," I said. "I want consistent access to the children." This was the only part of the conversation that carried weight beyond structure. Not because it was emotional, but because it was personal. Ethan responded after a pause that felt longer than the others. "That can be arranged," he said. No warmth, no elaboration, but it was enough. We did not discuss details. We did not revisit anything that had already happened. There was no apology, no attempt to repair what had been said or done. The conversation ended shortly after. When I set the phone down, I did not feel relief. I felt alignment. This was not reconciliation. It was definition. For the first time, the boundaries were clear on both sides. There was no confusion about what I would give, what I would not, and what remained between us. Later that evening, I sat by the window and watched the light fade across the buildings. The city moved as it always did, unchanged by any of it. I thought about what resolution was supposed to feel like. For a long time, I believed it meant restoration, a return to something familiar, a closing of distance. Now I understood it differently. Resolution was not about returning. It was about knowing exactly where things stood and accepting that position without needing it to be anything else. If you've made it this far and you're wondering how it all ends, comment number 8 below and stay with me, because now we're moving into the final outcome of this story. By early spring, the situation had settled into something steady, not comfortable, not familiar, but stable in a way that no longer required constant attention. The urgency that had once defined everything was gone, replaced by a quieter rhythm that I could move within without resistance. My hip had fully healed by then. I no longer thought about it when I walked across the apartment or reached for something on a higher shelf. The physical recovery felt almost symbolic, though I did not dwell on that. I had always preferred facts over interpretations. I made a few changes to my living space, nothing drastic, just small adjustments that made the apartment feel more intentional. I replaced the old chair by the window, reorganized the kitchen, and cleared out drawers that had held things I no longer needed. It was not about starting over. It was about making space for what remained. Ethan's situation had also stabilized, though in a different way. Through occasional conversations and what I heard indirectly, it was clear that the business had adjusted. It was smaller now, operating within limits that reflected its actual capacity rather than what had once been supported behind the scenes. There were no dramatic failures, just a gradual correction. Vanessa seemed less present in the background of our conversations. When she did appear, her voice no longer carried the same certainty. I did not speculate about what that meant. It was not my place to interpret their relationship. My communication with Ethan became minimal, but functional. We spoke when necessary, usually about the children. There was no tension in those conversations, but there was no warmth either. It was a neutral ground we both seemed willing to maintain. The children remained the one part of this that felt unchanged in the right way. We spoke regularly, short calls, simple conversations, small details about their days. Nothing complicated, but meaningful in a way that did not require explanation. I thought occasionally about everything that had led here, the money, the years, the assumptions I had carried without question. There was a quiet sadness in that reflection, but it did not linger. It existed alongside something else, understanding. I no longer measured what I had given against what I received. That equation no longer mattered. What mattered was simpler. I had stepped out of a structure that no longer belonged to me, and in doing so, I had found one that did. I wake up earlier now than I used to, not because I have to, but because I want to. The mornings are quiet in a way that feels earned. Light comes in slowly through the windows, settling across the room without interruption. I have come to appreciate that kind of stillness. My days are simple. I read more than I ever allowed myself to before. I take walks when the weather is steady. I keep my space in order, not out of habit alone, but because it reflects something settled inside me. There is no urgency in any of it, no pressure to respond, to fix, or to anticipate what someone else might need. For a long time, I believed that love did not require limits, that the more you gave, the stronger it became. I believed that consistency would be understood, that sacrifice would be recognized without being named. I understand now that I was wrong. Love without boundaries does not always grow. Sometimes it stretches until it disappears into expectation. Silence is not always interpreted as kindness. Often, it is taken as permission, and giving, when it is never measured, can become something others assume will never end. I do not blame Ethan for that entirely. He became the kind of man who accepted what was always there because I made it easy for him to do so. That does not excuse what he said or how he chose to act, but it explains more than I was once willing to see. We are not a charity. It was a simple sentence, direct, uncomplicated. And yet it revealed everything I had not allowed myself to recognize before. It forced me to look at my life not as I believed it was, but as it had actually been structured. What I did after that was not anger. It was not revenge. It was accounting. A quiet, necessary balancing of what had been given, what had been taken, and what I was no longer willing to offer without thought. My relationship with Ethan has not returned to what it was. It never will. But it exists in a form that is clear, defined, and understood on both sides. That, I have learned, is enough. What remains is not what I lost. It is what I finally kept. In the end, some stories do not close with apologies or restored connections. They close with understanding. There comes a point in life when you realize that not everything lost is meant to be recovered, and not everything given was meant to last forever. What matters is recognizing where you stand, what you deserve, and what you are no longer willing to carry. True strength is not found in holding on at all costs, but in knowing when to step back with clarity and dignity. Boundaries are not walls meant to isolate us, but foundations that protect what remains valuable within us. And sometimes, the quietest decisions are the ones that change everything. If this story resonated with you in any way, thank you for staying until the end. I would truly love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share where you are listening from and what you would have done. Do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this.